12:30. There are supposed to be 45 people for lunch, and only 37 have filled out the little tag tickets. So if you haven't already filled out your lunch choice, please do so.
Did you do your lunch?
I have one here. One here? Yeah, I'll be right here.
So I wanted to focus us on some practicalities of the grant application, the CICADA application, which resembles quite strongly some dimensions of the Instead application. So this will do for both exercises. But it shows us how we have to organize our projects. That is, with respect to axes. And any given project can relate to more than one axis, so you'll see some of them listed more than once. For example, Project 1.1 under Life Projects repeats under Axis 2, Customary Tenure Systems, as Project 2.1. We need information on these projects at two levels of detail. The first level of detail is roughly a page, a summary of a page to a page and a half. Which gives us enough context to understand enough about the project to write it into the grant application, to do some realistic budgeting. And then the form also requires a real thumbnail of each project. They limit you to 1,000 characters. So that's about 100 words. Which is maybe a third of a page double-spaced in 12-point font, just to give you an idea. So it's a very condensed description of a project. And I'll just flip forward here. These are our first three axes. Here are our fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh axes, all with their various projects neatly organized by the Funding Council's website. And this is the little 1,000 character description that's required for each. And if you write it for us, rather than requiring us to take 35 projects and condense page to page and a half descriptions down into these little boxes, it would really save us a lot of time. So I would ask every partner to do that. We're open to any project, excuse me, that we've discussed, or perhaps that we haven't discussed, that you think of later, that relates to the thematic axes of CICADA. And these projects can be projects either that you envision as funded entirely elsewhere, or funded partly by CICADA, or funded wholly by CICADA, or instead. and one of the, excuse me, although instead can most accurately be described as simply the Americas component of the larger CICADA agenda by going to both grant programs simultaneously. Thanks, Stephen. By going to both grant programs simultaneously, we can not quite, but almost double our annual funding if we're successful. So, but that funding still is not big money when you think about probably 30 partner communities and organizations, and you divide probably the maximum that we could hope to get if we got every dollar we asked for within the limits of these particular programs. It's about $300,000 a year. So by the time you subtract the costs of our meetings and our conferences, the regional meetings that have been proposed, the thematic axis workshops, the methodological workshops, that it doesn't leave a whole lot of money for discrete projects that will be conducted in partner communities as such. What we have done to date, and we think it's a model that is working fairly well, is take proposals for small grants. These are in the order of $8,000 to $10,000. And let's say over a 4-year cycle, we can probably afford, or would it be a 4-year cycle with Instead? It would be a 6-year cycle with CICADA. But maybe every other year, we would have the funds to do an $8,000 to $10,000 grant for each partner. Okay, it's not huge money. But as I explained before, the intention of the Granting Council is to actually support an infrastructure, a team infrastructure, a center infrastructure that is a launching pad for other proposals for project money. So, for example, John Galati's project went to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and got $2.5 million for the work in Kenya and Tanzania, principally, and some work in Uganda as well. Peter Brown's project, educating young scholars out of the orphan disciplines into more constructive professional orientations to the world. That got a $2.5 million, well, that one was solely from SHRC. I should mention that John's grant is partly funded by SHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and partly funded by IDRC, the International Development Research Council of Canada. So that's I think that you should tell us what projects you want, what projects would be helpful, and we can't guarantee that they would necessarily fit within the budgetary parameters of these councils, but they are an essential part of our planning as we decide ourselves to go to other sources. It could be the Federal Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, it could be the Ford Foundation, it could be the Christensen Fund, it could be the Trudeau Foundation. There are a lot of possibilities, really limited only by the energy that we have to do these pretty onerous application processes in any given year. There's not another big application in me this year, for sure. I'm going to be exhausted by November with these two and a third one that I'm doing for the Grand Council of the Crees. But next year, it's possible, and if we know that, and especially in April, we're going to hear whether we have this base funding, this basic funding from the Quebec Council, then we go forward. An example of one that's in process is the one that Terry described for us a couple of days ago. And that could be very pertinent to getting more significant resources into the hands of partners in the Americas, specifically to look at FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, and other aspects of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it's that kind of, it's cobbling together resources from multiple sources, and not only financial resources, but also contributions in kind, the expertise of various partners that might be transferred to other partners through the workshops that we can fund, and so on. So please, we welcome projects proposed by Indigenous partners in particular, by our academic members, by more typically by dyads, by groups of small groups, small teams of Indigenous partners and researchers. And this format that I've suggested, a page to a page and a half of a summary of what the project would be about, what its goals are, what its principal issues are. Then this condensed, super condensed thumbnail of the project. And also, and this is very important, especially in non-Canadian contexts, what are the realistic costs, for hiring a young person from your community to work as a videographer on a community video project, or to learn to acquire mapping skills and then to work over a period of months or years with your community organizations or your regional organizations. We don't know what the salary norms are in your context. We don't know what the travel costs are in your context. So it can be pretty rough, but some page kind of advice about how you budget different costs that you would see associated with the project that you propose. And if we, I know we're on a ridiculously tight timeline in some ways, but the ideal for me would be to have these projects within a week to 10 days, because I want a first draft of the proposal that I can circulate to members by the 15th of September. And I'll have to do that somewhat apologetically, because I don't know if I have the time or the resources to circulate that in 3 languages. That what we may do is a summary in 3 languages, and have to the more extended 25-pager we may have to circulate in English only. Yeah, Mario.
How detailed the budget of the small projects?
Sorry?
How detailed you need budget of the small projects, or just an estimate, a rough estimate of?
I think a rough estimate is very helpful. It'll allow us to see whether is this a project we can fund within our own kind of internal small grant, sub-grant rubric, or is it one that we have to build into a more ambitious proposal to another external agency? So that's good. But then the kinds of details, I don't think we need a spreadsheet that arrives at an exact total, but we need to know what the costs will be. Let's say it's 3 trips from a regional center to 4 member villages. What are the costs of that kind of transportation? Or what are personnel costs? Or if there's a more senior person from the organization who's involved in collaborating on a project, what are the norms for consultant fees or salary replacement, or however it is going to be done? It's more rates that we need, that are appropriate to the local context than a kind of subtotals all adding up to a tidy total. If you want to go to that level of detail, great, but I just don't want to produce so much work for people that they won't be able to do it in the next week to 10 days.
Sorry, Colin, what's the timescale of this? Sorry, you're looking at this is over a year, over several years? What's the...
Within the Americas, the instead part of it is a 4-year
Right.
horizon, and CICADA, which would be those would be resources that could be directed to Africa. That's a 6-year horizon.
Sorry, quick follow-up to that. So for the instead, you were saying that there's a possibility for small amounts of funding every second year, so we're really looking at 2 years possibility of community project?
Yeah, probably 2 years within instead, but CICADA funding can also go to the Americas. So, I would say, I think, I mean, tell us what is realistic, what works for you, and then we'll try to figure out how to make it fit the program rather than vice versa. I mean, I know there has to be a little retrofitting and recursive, but if you deliberately cut out something you want, just to fit the internal funding, then we won't know what we should be going for, to the foundations or the larger council grants. And I think, you'll have given us enough information that we can do the best we can towards your objectives within the parameters of instead and CICADA, and then be in communication about how we go forward. Jose and I have been talking for now over 2 years about who ideally we should go to in terms of foundations. We've considered Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Christensen Fund, partly I guess it's limited energies, and partly it's been the circumstances of the foundations at any particular time that have led us to postpone actually knocking on doors. But we do have a proposal for the Americas component on the hard drive, and we're pretty well ready to shop it around when opportunities arise. So I should also say, if you have any great ideas about money that might be lying around for these kinds of purposes, do let us know.
Colin. So Sebastian and I have been working on a draft of the axis description for mapping. We have to date 13 people who have given input on the form that we've circulated. I count 23 laptops open on the table right now. It takes about a minute to get the feedback, but we will be able to give you better advice if we hear from everybody as to what they want in respect to that access.
Thank you.
You can do it again.
And thank you to those 13 who filled it out.
Okay. So I think that's the core of practically what we need from
Just on a technical thing, who do you want us to email it to?
Email it to me, copied to Stephen and Margaret.
Okay.
So, another thing I would say, I know that life is complicated, and some people are not going to make this within a week or 10 days. If you don't, please still get it to us. But the important thing is that I get 70% of them within a week or 10 days, so that I can really flesh out a draft description. And also so that, Melanie and, I don't know, Margaret and Stephen, we're going to have a big job filling out the fields in this grant application, and So we need to distribute our effort, like literally starting tomorrow, we need to distribute our effort over time. So if we get some stuff, as late as October 5th or 6th, let's say, we can still knead it into the loaf. So if you're not able to deliver earlier, please still do deliver. Katie.
Is there the possibility for future projects within this grant? So let's say a project is proposed, or let's say not proposed now, is it able to do it later to draw on those funds? Or does there have to be something proposed now? Or if one project is completed, could a second be undertaken?
Yeah, no, I think we do have some discretionary ability, once we have a budget, and in principle, we'll be proposing some placeholders for the kinds of projects that have been put forward, but not necessarily with the assumption that we can't evolve, that we can't do more as time goes on. And also as other funding comes in. There's a whole series of smaller team and even individual grants that people are applying for that help to make up the whole. And you saw a list of some of them under our last application that I haven't mentioned and perhaps should have, but there is also that category of, if Brian goes to the council and gets what's more or less a kind of an individual standard grant from SHRC, it can relieve the pressure maybe on a particular project and free up money for someone who comes into CICADA or comes up with an idea that is not reflected in the current application. But clearly, if something is reflected in the current application, it has a certain priority. People put in the effort, they help to cook the loaf, and they get a slice of the loaf if we are successful in getting it out of the oven. Bannock. Ayakanao. Sammy's hearing his language. That was an intriguing bit of information that the Cree word for aikonao, for bannock or bread, looks to the linguists like it was originally an Iroquoian word that was imported into the Cree language. Ethnographic trivia. Maybe I should also say that just in terms of showing the vigor of our agenda and the resources that our partners, Indigenous, academic, collectively bring to this agenda, in-house projects that First Nations, Indigenous, community-based organizations, municipios, et cetera, projects that are in line with the themes of CICADA, why not mention them? And you say, we're doing this project over X number of months or years, and this is the value of this project in terms of salaries and organizational resources that we've put into it. This is not a commitment. It's not in the sense. This isn't this format for grantsmanship does not involve matching funding, so it's not like if you say, well, the Yashir are putting up a $10,000 project, are doing a project which is costing the share $10,000. It's not to say that that becomes a commitment that the funding council will then hold you to. It's more to say these are things that among the list of, the total list of projects that are being done. And it shows, it better shows the partnership and the texture and the relevance of some of the new work activities that we envision if they are connecting to live projects that our Indigenous partners are doing anyway. Is that concept clear? No? Because I was having a conversation with John Bishop last night, and he's an employee of the Cree Nation government through their cultural institute, and he has it very much in mind, this idea of matching funds. So when I suggested that, some of the Anistalgamuk's projects could, or at least a project that he's involved in, could be highlighted as a CICADA project funded by the Crees. His only concern was that this not be taken as a commitment, that then it becomes complicated for him to go to the Cree leadership. But it's not a commitment unless you actually are saying we're devoting cash and in-kind resources in order to leverage matching funding. This is not a matching funding program. Yeah.
I just have a bit of an issue with the scale here.
Monica, we cannot hear you. There's no.
Sorry, I don't know. Can I turn it on or?
No,
Yeah, it's
Okay.
on now.
Because, when you look at that project that's up there, the economics for the Anthropocene, that's a research program, and yet you could have then another description that relates to a very, very specific on-the-ground
and we do.
project.
I could have pulled up a very small one too.
But how is that reflected in the application? Are they given equal weight, or is there a way of organizing them that there's a kind of an umbrella?
Incredibly, no.
So they all have-
They're all projects.
Yeah, but do we then run the risk of a reviewer looking at that and thinking, this seems all over the place? Like, do we need to have some kind of internal structure that we impose?
Oh, absolutely, and that's your 25-page description is where you get to put those things into context.
So we will do a grouping of, so if you've got X number of smaller projects,
Yeah.
do we have a way of organizing them under a program of research?
Well, the granting agency requires you to group them under the thematic axes, and if necessary, to
But
repeat
it's still
them.
going to be a very, very long
But
list.
it's still going to be a long list, and so be it. That's what they're asking for. But of course, they can lose the forest in the trees, and so it's partly our job to maybe direct them to the website. So we've made a somewhat arbitrary distinction on our website, as you will have seen. We distinguish between programs and projects. So we use the word program for a larger scale endeavor with lots of partners and lots of researchers and big budgets. And then we talk about projects within some of those.
Could we not impose that logic on that structure?
No, we
in how
can't.
we represent
No, the
projects?
architecture of the online form is hardwired.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it leads to all kinds of kind of complications, which we've been discussing at our weekly meetings, where, for example, a project that is over 1 month before the beginning of our hopefully new cycle, it counts as a project. So don't assume because a project ended in 2016 that they don't want it listed as one of our projects. Things like that. So it's the kind of really organic sense of our agenda has to come out in our synthesis 25-page description. But we have to, all of these things are like little check marks which increase the number of points you get for live projects, for things that are actually happening on the ground in the communities. And, you know, that's, you know, so it doesn't hurt us at all to multiply, I think, the number of projects. We can have one or more projects from every Indigenous partner, one or more projects from every researcher involved in CICADA. And it's not that hard to do if it's, you know, each person around the table is doing one. It's not a big, it doesn't take a lot of time. But if we were to do it centrally and have to go, you know, email every community organization and every, you know, partnered First Nation, we wouldn't get done in time for the deadline. The hard deadlines, I should say, I'm talking about when we want a draft and then maybe a kind of for us, a kind of a final date when we can really accommodate new information around October 5th. But then the agency deadlines are in the third week of October for Instead and toward the end of the first week of November for CICADA. And our internal to the university, they actually close, they have control over our ability to make modifications up until the last minute. But it's a curious game, you know, because the university doesn't want their researchers coming with grant applications at 10 minutes to midnight and expecting to get, you know, vice presidents or vice principal signatures. So what they say is, you know, we're closing this thing 1 week before the agency deadline. And they talk a good line that they are closing it, and that's it. But then when you get there, everybody ends up having it reopened. But every time you have it reopened, to make a modification, you have to apply. You have to ask them. You have to get somebody on the phone or somebody email someone. So they make it increasingly difficult the closer you get to the deadline. It has to be something really urgent the day before for them to allow you access again to the form. So it's really hard to talk about a single deadline. In fact, we have kind of, you know, our ideal one for internal purposes, which, as I say, you know, is a week to 10 days from now for all the input information. And then a kind of a last one that we can feasibly work with, which is probably beginning of October. And then once we get into October 10th, October 15th, we're getting into territory where the university makes it quite difficult. It puts obstacles. I mean, they're accommodating at a level, but they have a routine which you then have to negotiate. So the sooner you can get stuff to us, the better is the bottom line. And I think I've already mentioned, projects that are currently active, even if they're about to end, projects that have already got funding and will be operating through some or all of the projected periods covered by our new grants. We want those. And projects that you would like to see, well, projects that are in the process of, like Terry's project is one that we know is unfolding, an application will be made, and it's important to say, okay, there's another major project which is contributing to the CICADA agenda, But beyond that, projects that we haven't even got underway yet, but that we want to see. I think, you know, that whole trajectory is part of imagining the future course of CICADA. Okay. Any further clarifications needed? Am I forgetting anything of practical importance that occurs to you guys at this point?
About the prioritary lists.
Oh, yes.
And people giving their opinion about their contribution and
Oh,
their
okay.
regular membership CVs.
Okay. Yeah, a message has gone out to the academic, the members based in Quebec. The members based in Quebec universities are required to do curriculum vitae, the Canada Common CV process, which is a real pain, I acknowledge. Took me from about 8 one evening until the wee small hours to get it done for another grant process. But we have to do it, and Melanie's been providing some support for people who are finding it difficult to come up with a time. So that support is there and available, and not just to people in this room, but to the larger group of CICADA academics who are based in Quebec universities. But one of the ways that they measure our quality as a team of researchers, without having to read through all our detailed CVs, having put us to the trouble of doing all these detailed CVs, the committees don't want to have to read them all. They want them there if they need to refer to them, but they say, okay, what are your 1 or 2 most important achievements in 3 or 4 different areas? And a message, if you're in that category, you've received this message, you know what I'm talking about. Margaret has just reminded us that if you haven't already given us that feedback about your most important professional contributions, please do so soon as possible. Again, these are things that in terms of the workflow of Margaret and Melanie and Stephen, can't all be done in one day, so we need this information to flow in steadily between now and over the next couple of weeks. Okay, so 10 past 12 now. I think we'll break for lunch at 12:30. Maybe we should come back to more substantive discussion of some of the more substantive issues that we were working at before the break. Sorry, I forgot where I had those. One thing I wanted then, we talked about a series of kind of procedural and methodological, processual issues. We've talked about some conceptual issues and topical issues. Maybe just focusing for a few minutes on personnel expertise that we might want to recruit to the current application or applications. It's not too late to invite, well-placed, let's say there was an Indigenous rights lawyer in in Panama that you wanted to invite to be a member of the team. You know, that kind of thing might be advantageous. There's been a call from at least 2 or 3 partners, you know, not to abandon archaeology. And, you know, we initially, with the Instead project, we had a couple of archaeologists who, for various reasons, have not been very active in fulfilling the agenda that we had envisioned with the original grant. And so I feel a little uncomfortable about highlighting archaeology in our project going forward, because although we have a couple of archaeologists in the Canadian context, we don't have any balance elsewhere in the CICADA partner network. So we, you know, in front of an academic committee of evaluators, we'd get dismissed, and that's partly why I've suggested taking out the cultural heritage theme as a separate thematic axis in Instead, as we've already done with CICADA, and instead look at culturally significant sites, sacred sites, burials, and so on, as part of integrated cultural natural landscapes. And that also means that we can cover some of those things with a kind of a broader, a more generalist expertise. You know, I know that Brian has an earlier degree in archaeology, but, you know, for archaeologists who might happen to be on a panel of evaluators, he wouldn't be, his professional profile would not be front and center an archaeologist. They would say, where's your archaeologist? You're planning to do archaeology here. So, you know, I think if we were to make that a central, or an important plank in our platform, we would have to recruit, you know, at least a couple of archaeologists who had expertise in Latin America, in Africa, in Australia. That's probably a bit too much of a reach at this point for the deadline we're coming to. But if, you know, but it's possible in this category or others. Another example that's come up is linguistics. We actually don't have a linguist on the team, but we're involved in mapping place names, you know, and narratives in indigenous languages. Now, a number of us have kind of acquired the basic competence required to transcribe languages that we don't speak well, to be able to work with local people who do have the language skills, but not always the literacy skills in that language. And we make it work, you know. So John works in that vein, and I've worked in that vein, and Brian's worked in that vein. You know, if you knew of a linguist from your cultural region, or a culture and language institute that, you know, for example, in CICADA in Highland, Guatemala, there's the Institute of Culture and Language that, you know, where there is some in-house expertise, almost no budget, but a couple of guys who are really enthusiastic about recording what is known in their own languages about their territory. So if there are researchers or centers or institutes of that kind that you think we should recruit, and that it's feasible in the time we've got to do so, let us know, or make the contact yourselves and let us know what the possibilities are. And I think a final thing that we haven't discussed in plenary much, it's been mentioned, are there other NGO partners that that perhaps we should be considering? And you know, I mean, one example, we've been working fairly closely in an earlier project with the Cree Nation government and the Wemindji Cree Nation, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and their Quebec chapter, SNAP is their acronym, have been very supportive in a long-term campaign to generate community-based protected areas. But we haven't actually formally requested their, you know, do we ask for a letter from them? You know, or are there other organizations? In one of our unsuccessful applications for instead funding, there were a couple of organizations that were involved in kind of the forensics of post-violent contexts in Central America and South America, who were going to partner with us. And unfortunately, the projects didn't pan out. But those are other examples. You know, the category NGO, of course, is vast. It includes all kinds of heterogeneous kinds of actors, from singularly unhelpful potential partners to extremely helpful potential or existing partners. So it's kind of in the judgment of each Indigenous partner which of these would be suitable to recruit. The East Africa project is the one that's kind of the most developed, the most developed example of our participating projects with as John was describing, and in his PowerPoint presentation, a whole list of community-based organizations and locally oriented NGOs. And we've got little of that in some other areas. Justin, you're looking a little, were you looking skeptical or no? No, not about East Africa, but about
I was more interested in if we are developing the kind of the forest peoples aspect of what's happening in Kenya, then that's a whole different strand which can be productively in relationship with what John's doing, but it's just a different, it's got a very different focus in a sense.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering how that would tie in terms of looking at what's going forward.
Yeah.
That's
Well, let me just mention that ICANN has its area of focus, and it's mainly rangeland-based.
Can't hear you, John.
John, the mic, can you pull the mic closer there?
But so ICANN has its own particular focus, which is mainly rangelands, but forests are also there, and we have some flexibility to move into other areas. We've got some idea of working in Uganda at some point. So I think we should discuss back and forth how we can collaborate.
Yeah, I guess it's how to collaborate without the more dominant kind of groupings taking over the space from the more marginalized in that process. That'd be great to look at that power dynamic going forward.
So our project is centralization of the margin. It's a coherent group
Sure, we will.
of marginal people.
You're reminding me of our old colleague Lee Drummond, who set up the Center for Peripheral Studies. Okay. We got 10 minutes left before the lunch. Stephen, I know you've generated a lot of notes over the last few days. Did you and I did ask on the kind of processual and methodological plane what your thoughts were, but what about the conceptual? Do we have bases that are uncovered from your reading of?
I mean, if you wanted to mention just what I was saying at breakfast, I don't know if it's related though. What I was mentioning earlier about fleshing out the kind of deep integral relations amongst the axes, if that's something that would be fruitful to, highlight in some way in our 25-page, or the kind of the deeper synergies between and amongst the researchers, so we don't seem to be kind of siloed, disciplinarians working in one particular area, but the deep ways in which the axes actually support each other, if that's something that would be of use. But I don't know if that's something that everyone at the table would have to sort of contemplate while they're submitting their 1,000 words, or I don't want to add too much onto the plate that isn't connected to the particular task at hand right now. But that's what I was thinking, that, moving forward, it'd be great to be able to demonstrate that we have a kind of a, there's a unity in what we're doing beyond just being focused on Indigenous rights and Indigenous development. Methodologically, there's a unity. Thematically, there's a whole conversation going on amongst us that may not be reflected in the kind of discrete thematic axes that FRQSC kind of imposes, that we have a thread that moves through them in a very profound way. And if that's something that we want to highlight in some way in the application, that as a center, we have a unity that goes beyond the kind of discretionary boundaries that the funding agency seems to be imposing upon us, or wishes to flesh out.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we did at least get to choose our thematic axes, but we are forced to describe ourselves in terms of thematic axes, encouraged, maybe better word than forced, but that's the language of the application. The idea of thematic axis working groups has been suggested, but then that doesn't necessarily address how, what are the cross-cutting linkages between axes. We do have, at this meeting, the Axis leadership has been visible because the Axis leaders were invited, but the Axis group members have been largely submerged. And when you look at the membership of each Axis, it includes almost everyone is a member of 2 or more axes. So there is that kind of organic integration at the level of personnel involved in CICADA. Yeah, so, okay. Any other thoughts, suggestions? Okay, well, we have, when we come back at, I guess now, at this point, it's probably going to be 2 o'clock. We'll have 1 hour before our closing reception. I wanted to say a few words about governance in that time slot. Because we have a received board of regional representatives, and I want to just explain who they are, and maybe have a discussion about how we would how we would address the question of governance in our application. We've mentioned at least one function of the members of the Regional Representatives Board, which would be to refer issues of political importance that arise from any members of CICADA that might require action on a fairly immediate basis. So there's that consultative aspect. But there are some other functions that we should address, and I think we need more than 4 minutes to do it. So I propose putting that off till after lunch. So why don't we break now and reconvene at 3 o'clock? Sorry, at 2 o'clock.
3 o'clock, we heard that.
Don't hold me to my word, please.